Thank you very much indeed. Welcome back. It's terrific to see a full house, and we've been very lucky with the weather. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to the two people I'm sharing this platform with. Mariot Leslie had a career in the UK diplomatic service as a former ambassador, UK ambassador to NATO, now back living in Scotland. Stephen Gethins, former MP, Scottish National Party MP for North East Fife, and now installed at St Andrews University. And please welcome them. We're here to talk, among other things, about Stephen's book, Nation to Nation, Scotland's Place in the World. So let me begin with you, Stephen. Why did you want to write this book?
It's a book, and thanks for having me along, and it's a great pleasure. It's a book that's been with me for a long time about Scotland's relationship with the other countries of the world. And we're sitting here at the Beyond Borders Festival, where we welcome people from throughout the world, that we talk about issues from throughout the world. And Scotland is impacted by international affairs. It impacts our domestic policy, and we impact the rest of the world. So what I was really keen on doing is that there's a discussion, well, does Scotland have a foreign policy or not? Well, it does. It's not something that's reserved to the Scottish Parliament. It's something that is the responsibility of the UK government. But given our international brand, given our engagement with other countries around the world, and the fact that foreign policy doesn't just begin or end with governments, but are to do with NGOs, with universities, with companies, with individuals, I thought it was time that we had a deeper debate and discussion about our place in the world, not least because our politics is being driven, if you like, by our relationship with the other countries in Europe. So it has a big impact on our domestic policy, it has a big impact on our day-to-day lives, and I was keen that we deepen that conversation.
Mariot, I wonder if in your years abroad representing the United Kingdom, you had a similar experience to me when I lived abroad, working as a BBC correspondent, because in some ways, in some countries, the BBC correspondent, the resident BBC correspondent and the resident UK ambassador occupy similar places in the imagination of the host country. And I'll give you an example. When I was the BBC correspondent in Paris, I was in a taxi, and Stephen mentioned the Scottish brand, and the taxi driver asked me whether I was English. And which Irish writer in Paris was it who, when asked that question, he always said, au contraire. So I said, no, I'm Scottish. And he said, oh. He said, you Scottish, vous êtes les Latins du Nord. You're the Latins. You're the Latins of the North. And instantly he sort of cheered up. What did you make of Scotland's brand when you were serving abroad? Was it distinctive?
Yes, it was, but I was very clear that I was employed by the United Kingdom. I was representing the whole of the United Kingdom. I represented Wales, I represented Northern Ireland, I represented England, I represented Scotland, and above all, I represented the British government and its institutions. So I was always very, very scrupulous about that. But when I was off duty, so to speak, and talking about the things that were dear to me, of course I talked about the bit of the British Isles that was most dear to me, and I talked quite a lot about Scotland. I think Stephen's book, I do recommend it. It's a very good read. What it does bring out is that Scotland had a distinct brand, but also had governmental representation abroad well before 1999 and the creation of the Scottish Parliament and the devolved government. I mean, I can remember, because I spent a brief couple of years working in Edinburgh for the then Scottish office, I can remember Conservative Secretaries of State for Scotland loving getting away from sort of opening bus stations in Alloa and going off to Japan to do trade promotion, and they do a bit of cultural stuff on the side. They would go to the United States. And Scotland had a recognisable brand, but too much of it, I think, was associated with tartan and tourism, and not enough with some of the things that we all know about the realities of modern Scotland. And I think that's what changed in 1999.
And how did the mechanics of it, if you like, change after the devolved settlement of 1999? Was there a change in the way the UK diplomatic service thought about the UK and its job of representing the UK abroad?
Well, when the Scottish government was set up after 1999, it drew up so-called concordats, sort of rules of the road agreements with all the other departments in Whitehall. The Foreign Office one was actually quite easy to draw up because it had been well prepared by the head of the policy planning staff at the time, one Mariot Leslie, and the head of the diplomatic service at the time, one John Kerr, who was born in Glasgow. So we were kind of conscious that there was an issue there, and we got on with it, and the thing got signed in good time. It basically said that for all the areas where the Scottish Government had a legitimate interest, and the Scottish Parliament did, they would be represented abroad and assisted by the taxpayer-paid diplomats in the same way as anybody else. And in practice, while there were still governments, both in Westminster and in Edinburgh, from the same political party, that was very easy. There were no real issues. It became more complicated when governments diverged over their policies.
Stephen, let's talk a bit about history, because before 1707, Scotland's orientation, if you like, was very strongly towards Europe. I went to Gdansk in Poland a few years ago, and it was like a grand and more beautiful version of the Grassmarket in Edinburgh. And I thought, you can see the connection, the North Sea, not as something that divides us, but as something that connects us. And Scotland's natural community before the union with England was that, if you like, that Hanseatic community.
That's right, yeah.
Where did Scotland sit then?
Well, it was really interesting. So our foreign, and I'm not a historian, but what I wanted to do was to illustrate the fact that this is not something that's new. It wasn't as if the Scottish Parliament came into being in 1999 and we woke up and thought, wait a minute, we need to engage with the rest of the world. This goes to the very fabric of the establishment of the nation. So one of the things that struck me, I was quite tickled by, was the only piece of writing that we have in William Wallace's handwriting was the Letter of Lubeck, which was actually a letter to the Hanseatic League that some might describe as the EU of its day, just when he became Guardian of Scotland, saying that, right, we've got our independence back again and we're open for business. So that idea of the Hanseatic League and the EU has always been something that's been important. And our relationships, and Professor Steve Murdoch was very good on this, our relationships have ebbed and flowed, but every country in Europe's relationships with its neighbours have ebbed and flowed through time. And they talk about times when we had common citizenship with the French, or common citizenship with the Dutch, the Flemish, the Norwegians, and Scotland even fell out with its close neighbours in the Kalmar Union, because I was being told that Scotland backed Swedish independence when this was something that was very unpopular at the end of the 17th century, which was one of Scotland's last major forays into foreign policy.
We might see whether they'll return the favour.
Well, they might. They might. Well, apart from Scotland's final foray into foreign policy, which was, of course, the Darien disaster in Panama, which was one of the big events that led to the Treaty of Union. And whether or not you support the Union or not, I think it's just recognising that our engagement with the rest of the world has had a profound impact on where we are today. Because
after the Union, of course, Scotland completely shifts its orientation and becomes an Atlantic trading power or country, and joins what had until then been the English Empire in North America. And it fundamentally changed the nature of Scotland's economy and society. And it did. And it's something that I think, and you read, and you should try and avoid reading these things online, but you read things about, well, Scots being somehow victims of empire, and you can talk about that in terms of the clearances, but you have to acknowledge the role that Scots played in the empire. And actually, Scotland didn't just rejoin that Atlantic trading area, although the relationship with the rest of Europe was very important. But of course, as well as trying to establish a colony in Panama, we'd also established a colony in Nova Scotia, entirely independent of being part. So Scots were aspiring, whether we like it or not, and it's something that, somebody like me, I believe in independence, and that's not a particularly comfortable part of our history. But I think we need to be honest about these things as well. And the other thing we need to be honest about is that role in empire has also given us a diaspora. Some people reckon that's about 70 million people around the world. So 14 Scots living around the world for every Scot who lives in Scotland. What a huge resource that is for Scotland, but also for the United Kingdom as well. And that shapes where we are today. Yeah, half of the 46 American presidents claim some Scottish ancestry. Most recently, of course, Donald Trump. Indeed, whose mum, and I know we heard from Alistair Allan, the MSP for the Western Isles, whose mum was from Alistair's constituency, and his cousins still live there, although I believe they keep a lot quieter about it than some of the past presidents' relatives. Before the Union, there was something like 40,000 Scottish families living in the Vistula Valley in what is now, well, was Poland then too. And when you read some of the correspondence at the time, there's an interesting echo, but in reverse, of the experience of the Polish people living here today, of many Polish people living here today, because there was a debate in the English Parliament in the early 17th century about King James's proposal for union between England and Scotland, and one of the English parliamentarians, they're all against it, they don't want the Scots to come anywhere near them, and one of the parliamentarians says, if we admit them to our liberties, we will be overrun with them. Witness the experience of the poor people of Polonia, he calls it, with all these Scots coming over and taking their jobs and undercutting them and performing services more cheaply than the local people. And it's an extraordinary mirror image of how do you, Mariot, how do you think that the accession of the Eastern European countries in 2004 to the European Union and the decision by Britain not to invoke the 7-year delay changed Scottish society?
Well, Scotland, of course, already had very large diaspora communities, both from Poland since the war and indeed Italy from way back before that, the end of the 19th century. End of the 19th century. So, I mean, Scotland already had substantial European diaspora communities inside it before that decision, but it did change it. I have to say, I think it changed it for the better, just as I think it changed it for the better in elsewhere in the United Kingdom, I mean, notably in bits of English towns. It produced more services, a bigger labour force. Remember that Scotland has really been struggling with pretty near full employment. There's structural unemployment, but there is a labour shortage rather than the reverse in Scotland. And I think European immigration from particularly the newish member states of the European Union, helped to plug that and boost the Scottish economy.
And Scotland's problem historically has not been immigration, but emigration and,
That's right.
and a shrinking tax base. The proportion of Scotland's population that is of working and tax-paying age is perilously low, isn't it, Stephen?
It is, and actually, it's one of the reasons that some people would argue for independence has been the demographic challenge. I think Ian Blackford talks about the fact that every other European country, Western European country, has seen its population increase, with the exception of Scotland, over the past century. If you look at the Dutch, the Irish, and elsewhere, because we have that issue with emigration. And we also have an issue with immigration, of course, because when you have immigration powers that are devolved and may suit one part of the United Kingdom, I think another area we need to explore is, well, do you devolve immigration? Because first of all, that forces Scots to explore, well, just how open are you to immigration, which is a good thing. You know, Scotland is the richer for a society that brings in people from around the world. And actually something that you see, and this is something, if you try and expand that argument, you see in other countries, in Canada, different states, and in Australia, different parts of that country will have different immigration rules.
And Mariot, you and I, in some ways, are living examples of Scotland's demographic problem, which is that we were born and raised here, educated here, by the state, at taxpayers' expense, most of us, and then as soon as we start paying taxes, we hike it down to London or abroad and spend most of our productive years there, and when we want to slow down, when we get a bit older, we come home like Atlantic salmon, and when we're on the verge of becoming a net cost to the taxpayer, we're back here. That's a problem for Scotland, isn't it?
It is, and I'm afraid my daughters have done exactly the same. They're both working in London at the moment. Look, I think we will be quite surprised if and when, as I hope and expect, Scotland becomes independent, at the number of people who come back in pursuit of the head office jobs that will be set up in Scotland to deal with a new reality. So I'm waiting to see, but if I can reveal a sort of minor state secret, both in 2014 and again in 2016, by which stage I was completely retired, it was quite surprising the number of senior members of the British diplomatic service and the armed forces on home leave in the summer from wherever it was they were in the world, who came to see me for a little talk about what the prospects for jobs in an independent Scotland might be. Now, we couldn't have found jobs for all of them, I have to say. I hope our armed forces wouldn't be that big. But the notion that the brain drain will continue without some sort of modification if Scotland were to become independent is, I think, wrong.
Well, I want to ask you shortly about how Scotland would set up the institutions of statehood in defence and foreign policy in the event of independence. But let's talk a bit about this, about the devolution settlement. You've got a chapter here called Foreign Policy Without a Foreign Ministry. How would you characterise Scottish foreign policy now?
So I'd characterise it, Scottish foreign policy is hidden in plain sight. It is there. We engage in foreign policy. It's something that the Conservatives developed in the 1990s, not just in terms of brand, but also in terms of trying to influence the European institutions, for example. And Philip Rycroft, one of Mariot's former colleagues in the civil service, who became the head of DECSU, the Department for Leaving the EU, talked about being a young civil servant and how they deliberately developed that brand with the Conservatives opening offices in Brussels. Under the Labour Liberal Democrat administration, you saw offices opening in Washington, D.C. and Beijing, and Jack McConnell, he's very proud, and rightly so, and I was able to interview both surviving former Labour First Ministers for this book, talks about setting up an international development fund, because he was keen that even though it was a reserved issue, that you should start to draw out that foreign policy, and that's expanded under the SNP. Now, where is it just now? It's in a case where, if you like, if you're a Scottish Government minister, your desire is independence. That's being driven by the Brexit vote, whether we like it or not. And if you look at John Curtis, the great cephalogist from the University of Strathclyde, talking about the shift towards independence coming as a direct consequence of the Brexit vote. So where I think Scottish foreign policy is at the moment, I think it's very focused on Europe and our relationships with the rest of Europe. It's focused on one or two areas like the climate emergency, increasingly on areas like conflict, increasingly working with the NGO community. And Mark here and Beyond Borders have done some fantastic work with women involved in conflict with the Scottish Government, but it's very limited. Now, I think it's a good thing it's very limited, because nobody should think of Scotland as a mini UK. You're entirely different. That's part of the point, and you can't do everything. But I have to say that given that our relationship with the rest of Europe has become so important, that it's probably an area that historically has been under-resourced and perhaps needs more investment in the future. Although I have to say that the appointment of Angus Robertson as Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs, Constitution and Culture, of course, I think
who's very strict, got a lot of experience living in Europe. He understands Europe very well.
He understands it. I think the fact that he speaks German and spent a lot of time in Vienna goes a long way. He spent years at Westminster focused on this issue. I mean, the whole thing has to go beyond one person, of course. But I think that's a good start. And it's also where foreign policy goes to the heart of where we're going to end up, whether we remain part of the Union or whether we become independent. And just to finish up, what I was really pleased with and struck by was the way in which friends and colleagues from the Labour Party, Conservatives and No Party are now engaging with this, actually. And Lord Howell, former Foreign Office Minister, wrote about the book in the House magazine, the House Commons and House Lords magazine, saying we need to engage with this subject because this is driving our debate, and you can't simply hide behind the fact saying foreign policy is reserved. We can't talk about it.
Yeah, I've been struck by quiet visits by European diplomats based in London to Scotland, who sometimes, ring around and ask to meet privately just to talk about the constitutional question. So there is definitely a renewed interest in this question among our European colleagues, our European friends. But my impression of it is that it speaks with a forked tongue. On the one hand, you could definitely sense a shift after the Brexit vote in the understanding of contemporary Scottish nationalism. A friend of mine said, who was living in Berlin at the time, a Canadian guy who now lives in Edinburgh, said in 2014 Germany was very freaked out by the referendum because Germany's experience of nationalism is well documented, shall we say, and they didn't like the idea at all. But he said after 2016, Nicola Sturgeon's a rock star in Germany. So it sort of changed but they still don't want an independent Scotland. I've yet to meet a European diplomat in London who thinks an independent Scotland is a good idea. Is that your impression too, Mariot?
Yes, definitely. Which is not to... I think there are two things here. One is no sovereign government is really keen on seeing the breakup of sovereign states. It's kind of in the DNA not to want that to happen. It makes life very complicated. It usually involves dispute. It often involves conflict and violence. It's sort of part of your natural default position not to want to see states breaking up, but instead to see states composing their differences and finding an internal political way of living together. So it's very understandable. What I do think changed after 2014, and then more particularly, as both you and Stephen in effect are saying, after 2016 and the Brexit vote, is that people started looking very closely at what it was Scotland stood for in Europe, in other European capitals, and started understanding that this wasn't the sort of nationalism that had caused conflict in Yugoslavia. It was a sort of nationalism that wanted to rejoin a European mainstream as a normal democratic country with good relations around its borders. And I think that more positive appreciation of the nature of Scottish nationalism got into the mainstream in Europe. But most European countries would still prefer us not to become independent. My estimation, my assessment, both from talking to people and also just long experience, is that if independence became a reality, in other words, we had voted for it, we had a good process that involved the consent of London and Westminster, and we were negotiating with our other British neighbours over the outcome, then the minute London had recognised an independent Scotland, there would be a queue that day of other European countries recognising it too and wanting to have good relations with it. But they're not going to do anything to edge it on its way.
And that puts the legitimacy of the process centre stage, doesn't it?
Yes.
This is a vital question. Stephen?
So you're absolutely right. The Brexit referendum, I don't think anybody can or should underestimate the extent to which that referendum has changed politics across the whole of the UK. We see it in England with things like the Hartlepool by-election and the makeup of the government. So it's changed the UK. It's also changed our debate here. And one of the things that I did in the aftermath of the referendum, I was the SNP's Foreign Affairs in Europe spokesperson at Westminster. And I spent a lot of time, and I've tried to reflect that in the book, spent time speaking to politicians elsewhere in Europe. And Mariot's right, you're not going to get Angela Merkel or Macron coming round in Leith and chapping on doors for the independence movement. But one thing I will say, and there's a challenge here for both those who believe in independence and the Union, which is, I'm not sure how many of them thought Scotland would vote for independence in 2014, but this has been taken deeply seriously across Europe now. I'm not saying that European leaders wake up every morning and think about Scotland. They don't, but I think it's been given a level of serious thought, and that provides a challenge. If you're pro-independence, it provides the challenge that, as Mariot says, the process, the way in which you gain independence is now being watched. So the very legitimacy comes from the way in which any referendum takes place and the conversations that you have as politicians, as activists, and as the media. Similarly, there's a challenge for the Union because people are waking up to the fact that if you look at any opinion poll, generations of Scots, you now need to be into your 60s before you are comfortably in a demographic that believes in the Union. So generations of Scots have switched off the state for which they carry a passport. And so this isn't something that's going away. So yes, they're taking it seriously. Yes, Mariot's right that they're not going to come out, and this is very much an internal matter for the state, but it poses very serious challenges for politicians on both sides of the political debate, and activists for that matter. I think everybody who's got an interest in this matter.
During the 2014 referendum campaign, Mariot, Mr. Barroso, who was then the European Commission President himself, the former Prime Minister of a small independent country called Portugal, said on the Andrew Marr show that an independent Scotland would have to get in the queue behind Kosovo for EU membership. Now, I was told at the time that he did it as a favour to David Cameron. It was, let's call it a diktat from an unelected Brussels bureaucrat that was for once welcomed warmly in London. And but Spain is a problem, isn't it? Spain could be a problem for any independent Scotland seeking to rejoin Europe. Supposing that an independent Scotland rejoining Europe is still a good idea, which is now highly questionable, but we'll get onto that in a second. Would Spain be a problem?
Well, first of all, Spain isn't Portugal, and I think Barroso might have reacted the way New Zealanders do when you say it's so nice to meet an Australian. But on the Spanish question, actually successive Spanish ministers have said very clearly what matters to them is the constitutionality of the route by which Scotland reaches independence. If Scotland were to do UDI, as Catalonia attempted to do, or some people in Catalonia attempted to do, you could expect Spain to refuse to recognise it, and you could expect Scotland's accession to the EU to be blocked. But if Scotland became independent through a process that was negotiated, recognised as constitutional by the United Kingdom or whatever remained of it, and then started negotiating in good faith, Spanish ministers have said in terms that that would not be a problem to them. They make a very sharp distinction between a constitution that prevents secession, such as the Spanish one, and processes that might or might not take place elsewhere. So if you look, for instance, for a practical worked example of this in the Balkans, Spain has refused to recognize Kosovo, which became independent through a process that was contested and without the consent of Serbia, which was ex-Yugoslavia. Montenegro, whose succession was approved by Belgrade, was recognized by Spain and is now a member of NATO with Spanish consent.
The great paradox about the Brexit result is that it probably makes Scottish independence more likely, but it also makes it much more difficult, because as an independent Scotland seeking to join the EU, there would be a border between the single market and the customs union and the rest of the United Kingdom. Is there any debate inside the independence movement and the SNP in particular, Stephen, about whether seeking to join the EU quickly would be the right course of action?
There isn't serious debate, and I'll tell you why. Again, it's going back to this EU referendum, but I think that reflects the profound moment in time that was. People in Scotland voted in a referendum to remain part of the European Union. Of course, as part of the United Kingdom, we then left. The independence movement has been driven by that vote. Now, you want to provide people with as much certainty as you possibly can, and in politics, in any area, there's always going to be a degree of uncertainty, regardless of what you do. But where I think there is certainty is that the SNP is united in terms of its approach to Europe. The Green Party is very much in favour of Europe. The one party who were pro-independence and argued against joining the EU straight away, the Allan party, gained 1.7% of the vote in the regional list at the election. So you have a unitary of purpose. I'm not saying there aren't people who would like to see independence outside the EU, but they're very much in the minority. And that gives you that kind of, that unitary of purpose on that area, so that you've got that certainty to tell people this is what we want to do as a movement. So I don't see that changing anytime soon because it's being driven. Now, you're right, around certain areas that need to be rethought. The border issue is very important. Sorry, I should also say, I'm so sorry, I should also say, just to give people a little bit of insight, the SNP was the most united party in terms of the Brexit process. When I was at Westminster during those Brexit years, and you'll all follow them on the television, there was mayhem in the other parties around this. Labour were struggling to figure out where to go. The reason it took so long, the Conservatives couldn't agree. I remember going to a group meeting, and again, going back, Angus was the group leader at the time, and he said to the group, and I'm going to tell tales out of school now, he said, this is a referendum. If anybody wants to campaign to leave, tell us, let us know. Nobody did. The group was unified. The group voted against the triggering of Article 50. So you have that unity of purpose around that issue, which is really important. But you're right. Other issues need to be thought about. The border issue in particular needs to be thought about. But the final...
It needs to be resolved, Stephen.
It does need to be
thought
resolved,
about.
yeah.
Because we've seen how absolutely determined the European Union is to defend the integrity of the single market and the customs union.
Yeah.
And the frontier would be at...
just down the road.
Berwick-on-Tweed.
Yeah.
That's a big problem, isn't it?
Of course it is. But we're in a set of circumstances whereby the final relation... Now, you're right. And so and it's the nice thing about being outside government and not being an elected member, you can turn it over to them and say, this is something that I sincerely hope Scottish Government, but also elsewhere in the resource, and universities and others are thinking about, because the final relationship between England and the rest of the European Union has not finally been resolved yet. But that being said, the direction of travel is for very significant divergence. We see that in Dover and the problems that are being caused, and we see that with Scottish producers and very significant problems being caused trying to access the world's biggest single market. So it is a challenge and a problem that we'll have to find a resolution. That being said, do you make, if you think that your neighbour is making a very, very significant economic error, and there aren't many people who don't think Brexit is anything but a significant economic error. They might believe in sovereignty and all these other issues, but nobody's making the case that this is an economically good idea. Do you pursue that good idea? Because let's not forget that that is a long-term, that England and Wales, as much as I would love to see them back in the EU, they're not rejoining. So yes, you're right, that it becomes more appealing, more likely, but the border does provide a significant challenge.
And Mariot, is there any third way there for a putative independent Scotland? Would it not make more sense to stay in a single market with the rest of the UK and seek us kind of halfway between what we have now and independence, something like what Norway has, perhaps?
I honestly don't think so. I mean, let's be clear about this. Norway is a member of Schengen. It accepts single market rules. It has a deal that Norwegians themselves grumble about because they say they are a sort of fax democracy. They get the rules down the fax line into Oslo and have to apply them. I think Scotland should be more ambitious than that. I think Scotland should be in the EU. I think, though, I think you're absolutely right, Allan. There is a massive problem over the border, and it needs to be faced squarely, and people need to describe that problem and understand it and discuss it. But let's also remember there's a question of timing here. Scotland isn't going to become independent tomorrow. About half of our fellow citizens don't want that. They haven't made up their mind yet. There is a referendum that hasn't been called. I think one will be likely sometime in the coming years, but I don't know when. I don't know how the campaigning will go. And after that, there will be a process of negotiation to independence if the Scottish electorate chooses to become independent. And beyond that, there'll be a process of accession to the EU. Now, let's just suppose, as a sort of thought experiment, that we have a referendum, let us say, in 2 years' time, and let us suppose that referendum opts for independence, and let us suppose that there is a further transition period during which Scotland leaves the United Kingdom, so we're talking already 4 years from now. During that transition period, it's not only London and Edinburgh that will be negotiating like crazy. Brussels would also want to know what was happening to its trade and cooperation agreement with the UK, which covers the whole of, I was going to say the whole of the British Isles. It doesn't. It does cover the whole of the British Isles, but it covers GB and then different provisions north and south of the Irish border. The EU would have a material interest in giving a mandate to the Commission to negotiate with London and Edinburgh over what became of the successor to that trade and cooperation agreement as it applied to the remainder of the UK. So the EU would have complete oversight of those negotiations pretty much from day one, all of which might reduce the timetable for Scottish accession provided member states agreed to it. But nonetheless, looking with the most optimistic view of the most pro-European person you could have, and you could include me among that, we're still looking 5, 6, 8 years into the future before you could begin to have the faintest hope of Scotland actually becoming a fully acceded member of the EU. Now, that's the other side of 2 British general elections. And I personally, I agree with Stephen, I don't see any prospect of England and Wales wanting to rejoin the EU in any foreseeable future, although who knows what will happen in the longer run. But I do think over the next 8 to 10 years, it is inconceivable that British governments wouldn't have a rather better, more functioning relationship with the huge single market on their doorstep than they have or want to have at the moment. So I would expect whatever has been agreed between now and then, between London and Brussels, to produce a rather more favourable outcome, a rather easier to manage outcome for relations between Scotland and England than the ones we'd be facing now.
If I'm understanding you right,
of the British government.
because we've got a Brexit that we've got in power in the UK at the moment, the people who led the Brexit argument and campaign successfully. So best case scenario, if I'm summarising you right, from your point of view, would be a post-Brexit British government that seeks closer alignment with the European Union, and perhaps it would not be Scotland that looked like Norway, it would be England and Wales that increasingly looked like Norway. And that would mean a prospect of more frictionless trade between that entity, England and Wales, and the European single market.
Yes, but we'd still have to be absolutely realistic that there would be a customs border between Scotland and England, and that would involve checks and it would involve the other things. But it doesn't need to be quite as stark as the chaos that we're facing at the moment. The other thing to say is that's goods. Services, as we know, are still very much up in the air. There isn't a complete single market in services, and the United Kingdom's relationship on services with the EU is also still up in the air and evolving as we speak. Then the third thing is just people like you and me going to see relatives in Newcastle or Surrey or wherever they happen to be. I see no reason why Scotland wouldn't be able to negotiate a common travel area for basic tourist.
As Ireland still has.
As Ireland still has done.
Just one last question before I open up to the audience. What would an independent Scotland's diplomatic service look like?
I think it would look very like the diplomatic services of other countries of a comparable size, rather like a Danish diplomatic service or a Norwegian diplomatic service. Small, perfectly formed, very clever, but not able to do everything.
So diplomatic representation in the major capitals of the world.
Yes.
And an agreement perhaps with the rump United Kingdom, whatever it would be
I mean,
called.
our closest relationship inevitably would be with whatever remained of the rest of the United Kingdom. It would be our single most important bilateral relationship.
So as a Scottish citizen, I might have diplomatic representation in Paris and Berlin, but perhaps not in Oslo or Copenhagen.
I'd be very surprised if an independent Scotland didn't choose to have embassies in all the European capitals.
So one last question, Stephen. I mentioned Oslo and Copenhagen. You have a chapter in here about the Nordic Council. What would Scotland's orientation naturally be towards the small independent states of northwestern Europe, and would an independent Scotland seek to emulate their kind of fiscal model? They're highly socialised by European standards economies.
So first of all, I think Mariot's absolutely right. Our most important bilateral relationship is and will remain that with England, with London. Our most important multilateral relationship will be the one with Brussels, with the European Union. But as my old geography teacher at school used to tell me, I remember day one saying there is no right way to look at a globe. And if you look at a globe, you will see that historically and for many reasons, Scotland has very strong relations with the other Nordic states, a lot of similarities, and I'm loath to talk about this sitting next to a former British ambassador to Oslo who will know much more about this than I do. But what was striking when I looked at it is already the Scottish Government actually does a lot of work on its Nordic and Baltic strategy, and it uses areas that it already has competence to build links with, say, helping out the Estonians during the EU presidency with a seconded fisheries official, talking to the Norwegians, I think, about sustainable tourism, talking to the Finns about education. This happens already. And interestingly, I spoke to Irish politicians across the political spectrum who are feeling quite remote from things at the moment. If you look at a map with Great Britain, if you the island of Great Britain taken out, and they've said to me, I mean, the chair of their, former chair of their Brexit committee in the Dáil saying to me, actually, Scotland could help us rebuild those relationships with the other Nordics. So I think there's a natural empathy. And I spoke to politicians in places like Denmark and Norway and Sweden, and they get that as well. They get that's not the first thing they think about when they wake up. But when they look at it, they see in international politics, you have to look at the opportunities and look at the relationships that can be built. And it was really interesting speaking to a former Danish cabinet minister who talked about the relationships and how they could build that relationship to their benefit, because that's what you're there for, after all, is to build relationships in your national interest.
Let's get some questions from the floor. If you have a question, raise your hand. Yes, there's a gentleman there.
Yeah, thank you very much for an interesting talk. Dame Mariot, you are very much for democracy. as I understand. And then if you look at Brussels, that's the most undemocratic institution you could imagine. None of them are elected. They are all appointed. And how can you make your admiration for democracy feel comfortable with that system?
I can imagine less democratic. I can imagine less democratic institutions. The Taliban, for example.
Or the House of Lords.
Yeah, Mariot.
Well, the question was put to me, so I'll try to answer it. I'm not sure who you think is unelected in Brussels, but the European Union consists of three main institutions and then a law court. The sort of governments represented around the council table are all elected by people like you and me in countries around Europe. The European Parliament, which is the second institution, is all elected. Their civil servants aren't elected any more than they are here. You wouldn't expect to elect British civil servants. But they are very accountable both to the Parliament and to the Council, and the Parliament in particular, which can't happen in this country, can bring down the Commission, and it would be the equivalent of the House of Commons sacking all the civil servants. That doesn't happen here. And then the law court, I hope you don't want elected judges. I think the politicisation of judges would be a very bad thing. So I must say I don't quite get what is very undemocratic about the European institutions. It is true that the democratic will of all the people through the EU has to be modified by the views of all the other people in the EU, and I'm afraid that's rather what happens in parliamentary democracies. Individual electorates don't get their individual electors don't get their say, but the majority of them do. And the EU has very, very elaborate rules for making certain that smaller countries get a bit more of the say and bigger countries with bigger levers to pull have slightly fewer votes per capita. So it does its very best in what is a multilateral setting to make sure that everybody's voice is heard.
There was a very interesting development when I was the BBC's Paris correspondent in about 2004, and there was something called the Growth and Stability Pact, under which every member of the EU agreed to keep their budget deficit under 3% of GDP, or face punishment from the European Commission, face sanction from the European Commission. Well, the first two countries to break that commitment were France and Germany, and the European Commission wanted to move against those two countries in accordance with their treaty obligations, and the Commission was trumped by the Council of Ministers. And that was very telling about where real power in the EU lies. It lies with the elected governments, with the body that represents the elected governments. And France and Germany were allowed to break their treaty obligations because there were powerful countries within. It was very. I mean, it's hard to get a large and excited audience about this, but it was quite telling at the time about where power lies. Is there any other questions?
Yes.
Oh yes, hello, Robert. Yeah. I didn't see you there.
I'm very pleased that both speakers recognize that a long transition period is required. In fact, the 1707 Act of Union and the 1801 Irish one had longer transition periods, as did when we even joined the EU than when we left with Brexit. But we could be a transition period of a generation, which is a very long time. What my question is, why do you think independence could, if over that period, achieve less dependence on the outside world than the dependence we have today with London? Because 2/3 of the world's economies are long-term deficit traders. More important than trade is private capital flows. Of course, the Republic of Ireland has had a wonderful trade deficit, one of the highest in the world. But all those years, it has a huge balance of payments deficit because the money just flows to London. What is it that really brings about true independence in economics, social and cultural, and not just diplomatic and political?
Stephen?
Well, firstly on this transition, I know Mariot picked up on this, but of course on transition, that's a matter for the politicians to negotiate in the event of a referendum. So if the people of Scotland decide that they want to be independent, then that will be a matter for the politicians to negotiate. So I'm afraid I don't quite agree with you on that term of a generation, but actually it's not up to me to decide, it's not up to us to decide, it will be for the democratically elected politicians to decide. And in terms of the flow, I'm not an economist, I have, and this is not a book about economics, but on the point, I'm struck by Ireland. Ireland has a better quality of life and a higher standard of living than the United Kingdom does. Now, if politics is for anything, politics is for bettering the quality of life and the opportunities for your citizens. I was amongst the first generation of politicians going through that process who were deliberately creating fewer opportunities for the generations who came after me than I enjoyed. I can't remember another political generation who went through that. And so, yes, you're right. These are issues that need to be defined and decided, but fundamentally our politics in any decision should be not based on lines in a map, not based on ethnicity, but should be issues that are decided on whether or not is this the right decision for a generation of individuals and people and the future generations that come afterwards, and we should be debating and discussing on those on that basis.
One last question to Mariot. The term that Robert used there, true independence, we don't know what we mean by that. But how would you conceive of sovereignty in a post-independence Scotland? What kind of sovereign state would it be?
I think I'd start by saying, let's all remember that all of us are interdependent. So, I mean, Brexit has shone a spotlight on the fact that the United Kingdom always had sovereignty. It still has sovereignty. It had sovereignty before and after it left the United Kingdom. But your sovereignty allows you to make choices, but you can't make choices that defy the laws of nature, and you can't make choices that defy the laws of international politics. So if your choice is to have a parliamentary vote that the tide will no longer come in, the tide might trump you. If your choice is that you're going to be very, very rich by inventing a phony currency and not trading with anybody, then real life might catch up with you. So for me, what I want to see by way of sovereignty is a country where people feel they have something in common with each other to the extent to which they're willing to accept the political choices of the majority of them on the grounds that they're willing to have an argument and have a crack at another election for something different the next time round. And my sense is that Scotland is not in that place at the moment inside the United Kingdom, but could be in that place inside the Scottish borders with its own polity, making its own decisions. Now, I'm willing to take a punt on my fellow Scots, mostly making good decisions, but I'm also very willing to recognise intellectually that some, perhaps in my generation, perhaps in future generations, perhaps in grandchildren's generations, might make bad decisions. What I do think is that they're more likely to fit the climate, the geography, the economics, and the external circumstances of Scotland than decisions made mostly in the south of England, which is the direction of travel that I think otherwise is our fate.
There is a hand up at the back there and another one down here, but unfortunately we've run out of time now, but we can continue the conversation, if you forgive me, outside in groups, and Stephen and Mariot will be here after the event. Mark, you want to say something?
No, I was just going to congratulate you on a fantastic talk, but also just simply to say thank you to one person who arrived late, and that is Angus Robertson, who is here. Stephen, you've been telling tales outside of school, but Angus has arrived. And the reason why I just wanted to thank Angus is 11 years ago, we set up Beyond Borders to see whether or not Scotland could contribute in soft power diplomacy ways to peacemaking and also to increase international cultural exchange to try and overcome conflict between certain nations and groups. And as many of you know, we have brought many different groups here to Traquair to try and help them overcome conflict, and also through this festival to try and promote greater international understanding. The reason why I wanted to thank Angus on a personal level, not an official level, but on a personal level, is 11 years ago when we were building this institution, with the help of Elizabeth Smith, who hopefully is in the room as well, we reached out across the political divide to a number of elder statesmen and women. He wasn't so much an elder statesman back then, but to help us in this enterprise. And I remember seeing and bumping into Angus in the House of Commons and telling him about this initiative. Now, he didn't know me, but he, I think, knew a good idea when he saw one. And I just want to formally record my thanks to Angus and Elizabeth, because without those types of people, notwithstanding having a castle in your back pocket, you actually do need across the political divide support. So thank you very much, Angus, and welcome to the
Thanks, Mark. And I'm going to ask you just to thank once more Mariot Leslie and Stephen Gethins. And by the way, you can buy this book, which has an introduction written by one Mark Muller-Stewart, in the bookshop, and Stephen will be available to sign it, if you would like that.
Yep.
Thank you.